Dr. Benjamin E. Park. He teaches religious history at Sam Houston State University in Texas, where he's also the director of the Graduate Studies program there. He's published articles in over a dozen venues, and I have to say, I looked at your CV, and it's much more than a dozen. In his first book, American Nationalisms, Imagining Union in the Age of Revolutions, which was published by Cambridge University Press, was a finalist for the very prestigious Lasky Award in Political History. Dr. Park is also a co-editor of Mormon Studies Review, and his edited textbook, The Blackwell Companion to American Religious History, will be out in January. Tonight's lecture is drawn from his most recent book, which has been fabulously reviewed, which is entitled The Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier. And that was published this year by W.W. Norton and Liverite Press. This has been reviewed in many publications, but I just want to highlight two here, the New Yorker Magazine and the Wall Street Journal, again, among many venues. Dr. Park is currently working on two projects, a general history of Mormonism in America, and a study of religion and abolitionism in the antebellum period. And all of that is to say that he's a very busy man, and we very much appreciate him being here with us. And I hope you all enjoy and appreciate Ben's talk. So thank you, Ben. And it's now to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to express my thanks to Michael for setting all of this up. And as someone teaching digitally this semester, I know all the technical woes that can happen. So you've managed them ably. I want to express also thanks to Gary Burton and the Thomas Paine Cottage. I've always been a fan of Thomas Paine. Randomly, this is almost bringing my work full circle because my first master's thesis was on Thomas Paine and religion. And now being able to connect that to my most recent book topic was a dream come true. The only thing that would have made it better is being able to deliver this in the Thomas Paine Cottage, but sadly, 2020 is what it is, and we'll have to look forward in the future to rectify that. I also want to thank Nora Slominski for the wonderful work she does with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College, a model for the type of work that scholars can do to connect our great historical work with the general public. And so it's a great honor to be a part of it this year, however a small one. By the 1840s, Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. could claim quite the prestigious title. They believed that they were parents to a home-born prophet who had been raised in America and who, within several decades, had garnered tens of thousands of followers. But decades earlier, in the 1790s, they were just like many of their contemporaries, earnest believers in a vague form of Christianity, but unaffiliated with any of the organized denominations. Their spiritual quests were not the same, however. Lucy, in part due to a lifetime of personal loss, was much more open about longing for a religious community. Joseph, on the other hand, raised in a family of unorthodox thinkers, was a self-described visionary, more willing to pave his own path. But once they were married, they were eager to find a denomination to which they both could finally belong. Eventually, after consistent tugging and pleading, Lucy had convinced her husband to attend a nearby Methodist meeting. And at first, he agreed. But soon word got out to his family, and Joseph's brother Jesse and his father Asel stormed through Joseph and Lucy Mack's door, threw a book at Joseph, and demanded that he read it until he believed every word. The book they threw at him? Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, the bombastic tract that was only a few years old at that point. In this aggressive act, Jesse and Asel Smith were acting as missionaries in Thomas Paine's anti-Christian movement, fulfilling Paine's hope that the nation could shed the shackles of Christianity, just as they had shed the shackles of monarchy a generation before. And even if Paine wasn't able to garner as many converts to this cause as he had to the one before, Joseph Smith Sr., for instance, even in his most unorthodox moment, still believed in the Bible. Paine's diatribe against organized religion proved a divisive topic in the young republic, still struggling to define their religious identity. But if Paine's position represented one point along a dynamic spectrum concerning how religion should play a role in a democracy, Joseph Smith Sr.'s son, Joseph Smith Jr., represented another. Indeed, much of the younger Smith's beliefs and activities in founding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons, reflected a distinct rejection of the very type of society Paine envisioned to a number of degrees. And by the time Smith established his own city-state, Nauvoo, on the Illinois banks of the Mississippi River in the 1840s, the number of Americans who had chosen to follow the quixotic prophet had proven that the particular future Paine had envisioned, an America in which irrational and enthusiastic religions would disappear into the night as the light of reason shed across America's expanding empire, had not come to pass. Yet at the same time, the violent struggles that accompanied Nauvoo's existence and culminated in Joseph Smith's death at the hands of a neighboring mob exemplified the same warnings Paine had trumpeted in his many works, if in unexpected ways. Tonight, I'd like to consider Mormonism's Nauvoo saga through the lens of Thomas Paine, as a way of exploring the evolving and inchoate boundaries of religious liberty in early America. Today, most Americans believe that the political system of democracy is inherently tethered to the practice of religious freedom, but the experience of those on the nation's cultural margins during this early period highlight how such an assumption was far from assured. Indeed, in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville had posited that the organization and establishment of democracy in Christendom is the great political problem of their time, and that even if the Mormons had yet to resolve the problem, they were to furnish the useful data to those who will undertake the task. Tracing a line between these two prominent figures, Paine and Smith, on this great political problem, I hope, can help us gain focus on the much larger question of religion and democracy. Thomas Paine's rebellion against traditional Christian thought is well known. His three-part treatise, Age of Reason, attacked the theological, literary, and social foundations of organized religion, focused particularly on Christianity. But what often gets overlooked is the political implications of his arguments. As scholars like Christopher Grasso have highlighted, directly attacking traditional ideas on religion, especially the Bible, were akin to indirectly attacking the ideological structures upon which society was built. They were both an undermining of cultural authority as well as social cohesion, envisioning a community built upon and governed by a distinctly different model of power. So when Paine insisted that the new American nation rid itself of its biblical identity, he was hoping that citizens of the young republic would embrace a method of knowing based on what he called rationality, a country predicated on rational discourse in which ideas rose and fell based on their merit, not on authority or tradition. The personal conscience, in other words, would be untrammeled, and each individual could make choices rooted in their own interests rather than the priorities of the ruling elite. In his mind, a democracy could flourish in nothing less. Yet as the combative reception of Paine's work signified, of course, not everyone was willing to embrace such a vision. Paine's deism was a threat not just to sacred theological truths, but also significant social foundations. As a result, Paine was publicly attacked as an ideological traitor who no longer had a place in the country he helped call into being. But that doesn't mean that many of his core ideas fell into disrepair. Thomas Jefferson, who shared much of Paine's distrust of traditional Christianity, proved to be a more pragmatic and less dogmatic executor in his attempt to decrease orthodoxy's influence in the young republic. Like Paine, Jefferson believed that a free marketplace of ideas would prove the knell to enthusiastic and irrational faiths, even if he felt the dialogue did not require Paine's caustic bombast or even public critique. Rather, he suggested that irrational sects would die out on their own. And Jefferson's deep belief that rationality would win out resulted in his famous, and in some circles humorous, statement that within a generation or two, all citizens would reject the more enthusiastic faiths of evangelicalism and embrace a much more reasonable form of belief. There was not a young man now living, he wrote in 1822, that will not die a Unitarian. I don't think it's a spoiler to note that Jefferson's and Paine's predictions turned out to be untrue. They were good at many things, but prophecy was not one of them. America's disestablishment, or the separation of church and state, resulted in many unintended consequences, but one of them was the broadening rather than the narrowing of evangelical faiths. According to the classic thesis of Nathan Hatch, those evangelical denominations that thrived were those that embraced the democratic spirit of the age. More recently, other scholars, most notably Amanda Porterfield, had argued that these groups also and simultaneously took advantage of the widespread doubt in traditional authority that Paine's argument instilled, capitalizing on a vacuum of authority left in Paine's wake. But notably, however one defines this evangelical awakening, one must note that their break with Paine was not in total. While they rejected his anti-Christianity, they embraced his pro-individuality. The individual believer, not the institution, not the tradition, and certainly not a state-sponsored ecclesiastical hierarchy, took precedence. To a certain degree, Joseph Smith and early Mormonism represented both of these religious trajectories. On the one hand, their empowerment of average converts through a lay priesthood, including the bestowal of a biblical prophethood on an undereducated farm boy, explicitly embodied the democratization impulse of the Hatchian narrative. But underneath that quasi-democratic veneer were deeply rooted authoritarian strains, attempts to restore the very forms of hierarchical power that Paine abhorred. And remarkably, thousands of converts found these seemingly anti-democratic messages convincing, as they supposedly provided structure in an otherwise aimless era. While I could highlight a number of divergent expressions shared from this, that stem from this shared anxiety, I'll focus my remarks tonight on only two, the prophetic and the political. Because Joseph Smith's mission, culminating in the city-state of Nauvoo, represented an important, if sometimes overlooked, lesson of antebellum America, that there were many who feared the democratization project had gone too far, that too much power had been granted to the common man, and that the only solution was return to a top-down leadership structure centered in the power of an ecclesiastical priesthood, an idea that would have made Paine shudder. First, to the prophetic authority. It's safe to say that prophets were not en vogue during the early republic. Even among those most stringently believing in the Bible, prophetic authority was a thing of the past, the remnants of an ancient order long since replaced by a new structure that empowered the body of believers over the body of an individual. And to many, self-proclaimed prophets, as in the many denunciations of prophecy during the Age of Revolutions, elucidated in Susan Juster's book Doomsayers, disrupted the controversial order and threatened the individual conscience of believers. Prophets, in other words, were cast as anti-democratic rogues. Thomas Paine took this steps even further. Prophets, he argued, were not only unwelcome in the present, but they were fabricated in antiquity. Moses, for example, was a fictional character drawn from the tradition the Israelites had encountered in Egypt. And after their departure from that country, he wrote, they put him, Moses, at the head of their history. Paine argued that even, quote, the manner in which the Genesis account opens shows it to be a tradition, as it begins abruptly, and it speaks, and it is nobody that speaks. It has no voucher. Moses does not even take it upon himself by introducing it with the formality that you would expect. In other words, because the Genesis text does not open up by saying, I, Moses, say these things, it shows it's just a traditional document, and Moses can be cast aside as a fictional character. In Paine's mind, then, emphasizing the holes in the Bible's historicity also poked holes in modern Christianity's belief system, as even if most Americans had forsaken the idea of modern prophets, they still rested their authority on ancient ones. Joseph Smith, conversely, addressed both attacks, the Paine and the evangelical, at once. Indeed, he believed that in order to buttress his own prophetic authority, he had to reaffirm ancient prophetic authority as well. One of his first projects, after proclaiming himself a modern revelator in 1830, was to embark on a new translation of the Old Testament, filling in doctrinal holes and connecting its theological message with his own. And what did the first verse of Genesis look like in Smith's new formulation? Well, it was the word of God which he spake unto Moses at a time when Moses was caught up to an exceedingly high mountain. Those were the new words of the account of Genesis. So even if not a direct counter to Paine, I haven't been able to determine the degree to which Smith was familiar with Age of Reason, although a scholar by the name of Grant Adamson has been doing some great work on this. It is certainly at least an indirect response to the age of skepticism, which required reaffirming ancient biblical teachings. Yet Smith did not stop there. Besides providing a more explicit prophetic voice to Moses, he also exemplified one for himself. Thus saith the Lord began numerous revelations that Joseph dictated, providing contents that range from doctrinal specificities to instructions on where to build a physical storehouse. In a republic where citizens took pride in the individual conscience, Mormonism provided prophetic dictates. In an expanding empire that defined itself on geographic mobility, Joseph Smith specified where one should live. The doctrine of the gathering, as the believers put it, seemed to fly in the face of the idea of liberty that was seemingly enshrined in the young nation. As one historian put it, Mormonism, even during its tamer early years before Nauvoo, could be defined as Methodism with a Moses thrown in the middle. Now, to return to Paine, these principles were part and parcel of the great pamphleteer's greatest fears. For a republic to function, he believed, the personal conscience had to be left free, the individual mind left unencumbered. And even while his more heretical deistic arguments were largely set aside, his libertarian emphasis was quite a bit more representative of America's trajectory. Both Paine and a majority of his critics, therefore, while they disagreed on Moses's authoritative status, would still agree that Mormonism's centralization of authority, the modern-day Moses, was inimical to the American vision. So it has to be asked, why did Smith's message gain so many followers? Well, while most Americans during the period praised the social transformation that brought more choice and opportunity, the people who populate the famous democratization thesis, there were other groups like the Mormons who worried that America had lost its way. The saints believed that the nation had forgotten its true purpose and was in need of a return to divine values. Too few people followed divine commandments. Too many people were left behind. Too much chaos seemed to reign. Nauvoo was to be an asylum for God's chosen people as they escaped a quickly falling world. Unlike other frontier cities that aimed to expand America's national ambitions, the Mormon kingdom was designed as its check. It's important to remember, in other words, that democracy, even a half century after its inauguration, was still an experiment, and some had come to think that it had run its course. The famous story of the kingdom of Matthias is but one radical example of this countercultural trend, but similar impulses can be found throughout society among groups worried that the majoritarian culture would trample upon individual rights. And it would not be until the Civil War, and especially during the Reconstruction Amendments, that provisions were installed to protect personal liberties against what many decried as the tyrannies of communities, counties, and states, paving a way to preserve the rights for the individual in the Constitution. Few voices of democratic discontent were as loud in this cause as the Mormons, of course, and few proposed solutions were as radical as their anti-democratic tenor. To Joseph Smith and his followers, true freedom was to be achieved through actualizing their role within a divine order of being. Perhaps the most potent representation of the societal vision came from one of Joseph Smith's apostles, a guy by the name of Orson Hyde. In a sketch he titled Diagram of the Kingdom of God, Hyde depicted at the top of the pyramid the eternal Father that sits at the head, crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And below that one point were ecclesiastical and familial pedigree lines. Almost looks like the old great chain of being. Hyde wrote that wherever the one line meets the other, there sits a king and a priest unto God, bearing rule, authority, and dominion under the Father. All of human society, in other words, was governed by this priestly network. This was a theology of the state, that is, how individuals related to society and how communities were to fit together. If much of mainstream culture during this era was a centrifugal epoch in which citizens circled away from centralized authority, as Nathan Hatch described, Mormonism attempted to reorient those dispersed pieces back into a coherent whole. To Hyde and his fellow Mormons, liberty could only be experienced within an ordered society, the very type of a structured hierarchy that Paine warned would accompany religious tyranny. Now to the political angle. Though ideas concerning the separation of church and state were still, to put it lightly, fuzzy during the Jacksonian period, there were at least some main points of agreement. For a majority of American citizens, for example, disestablishment did not imply the separation of religion and politics, far from it. To Thomas Paine's chagrin, most believed that political ideas had roots in religious, i.e. Protestant, ideals. Where most Protestants drew the line, however, and this is where they actually held something in common with Paine and Jefferson, was with regard to ecclesiastical intervention. Governments, on the one hand, were not to favor one religious body over another, though interpretations of a religious body were often vague and flexible. But ecclesiastical leaders, in turn, were not to infringe on the rights of their congregants. And while ministerial influence was still common and indeed assumed, especially on the frontier, it was expected to fit the form of republican persuasion rather than clerical demand. This is where the Mormons, of course, transgressed these acceptable boundaries. While they experimented with these boundaries of democratic responsibility in Ohio and Missouri, their greatest challenge came later when they were settled in Nauvoo, starting in 1839. After a decade of being forced from state to state and witnessing a government unwilling and unable to intervene on their behalf, they believed that the only way to secure power was acting as a political body and voting as a bloc at the discretion of Joseph Smith. As one Nauvoo resident explained in a letter to his non-Mormon father, "We give our votes to the Democrats on some occasion and the Whigs on the others, so that through our great influence, we can gain an influence we desire." One Mormon leader, John Taylor, who was an editor of the church's newspaper, was forthright in defending this action. Quote, "It can serve no good purpose that half the citizens should disenfranchise the other half, thus rendering Nauvoo powerless as far as politics are concerned." The Mormons, therefore, had found in their minds their route to political influence as a religious minority within a democratic society. Group mobilization through the direction of their prophetic leaders. The 1842 state election provides a potent example of how this worked. The weekend before the election, Joseph Smith stood up in front of a large gathering of the believers and declared his support for a certain slate of candidates that they were going to be voting on in a few days, a list that was then reprinted in the church's newspaper. Voting in one of Nauvoo's precincts then took place in the office of Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother and the second in command of the church. And it is likely that church officials just hung out in that electoral office most of the day. Individuals who lived within that precinct would then march into that office, orally pronounce their votes, which were then tallied carefully in a ledger. And of the 457 people who voted on that day in that particular Nauvoo precinct, only 11 did not follow a precise pattern that had been dictated by Joseph Smith. And given the split power between Whigs and Democrats in Illinois at the time, Mormonism's thousands of votes in the region were enough to swing local elections. Parties across the state soon admitted that they were now, according to one key operative, quote, depending on the Mormon vote. Outside observers were obviously outraged by what they believed to be a corruption of the democratic process. Drawing on political reciprocity and group identity was one thing, but orchestrating electoral votes was quite another. American disestablishment was meant to prevent this form of intersection and backroom dealing. The editor of a nearby rival newspaper stated that while Mormons had the same rights as other religious bodies, as soon as they, quote, step beyond the proper sphere of a religious denomination and become a political body, they lose their right to appeal to religious liberty. Another critical newspaper denounced Mormon voting patterns as a clannish principle that was repugnant to the principles of our Republican government and designed to tyrannize over the minds of men. These terms, clannish and tyrannize, of course, they echoed the same type of anti-Mormon or anti-Catholic rhetoric that you would have found in Eastern states at the same time. This was a point of agreement that these citizens would have had with Thomas Paine. Block voting and ecclesiastical intervention were, both to Paine and the evangelicals who despised him, a tyranny over the personal conscience. Democratic practice required the expression of individual will and a detachment from denominational loyalty. To Mormons, however, democratic rule had to be checked by the interests of these smaller groups. At the heart of this conflict was contrasting visions of liberty. Was liberty the chance to freely operate within society, or was it the ability to work within particular communities that were interwoven together underneath a broad national umbrella? Was religious freedom something to be experienced collectively or individually? Critics accused Mormons of subverting religious freedom and threatening the democratic order. Mormons countered that they were merely exercising their religious freedom to act as a collective. To borrow contemporary terminology regarding corporate laws, the question regarded whether religions could be classified as persons. These tensions continued throughout the entirety of the Nauvoo sojourn, as Joseph Smith became increasingly bold in his directives and the saints increasingly determined to fulfill his wishes. The climax of this conflict came in late 1843 and early 1844, when, after a spectacularly bold electoral ploy cost them the support of both state parties, and I'd be happy to discuss that moment more in the Q&A, the saints attempted to find a new form of sovereignty that could save them. First, they turned to the federal government, sending petition after petition, pleading for Nauvoo to be designated a federal territory outside of state control. They argued for Congress to expand its own authority to a radical extent that would not be matched until the abolitionist arguments in the following decade. And when that failed, they nominated Joseph Smith as a candidate for the American presidency, sent out hundreds of what they called electioneering missionaries, and hoped that the right man could finally correct America's misbegotten course. And yet the radical Mormon response did not even end there. Fearing that the American experiment was fully lost and beyond repair, they also envisioned its replacement. In March of 1844, Joseph Smith and his closest followers organized a secret organization they referred to as the Council of 50. And at its first meeting, participants clearly stated that their goal was to, quote, establish a theocracy where the voice of God could finally rule. Smith had earlier written that the earth, as a result of the excess of democracy, was, quote, rent from center to circumference with party strife, political intrigue, and sectional interests due to the fact that no nation or kingdom acknowledged the role of divine rule. The solution, according to Smith's new political organization, was to, quote, amend the Constitution and make it the voice of Jehovah. They therefore resolved to draft a constitution which in their mind should, quote, be perfect and embrace those principles that the Constitution of the United States lacked. This was, of course, not a fully unique endeavor, as there were plenty of people during the 19th century who dared to see flaws in America's founding document. But what was especially noteworthy about the Mormon example was that this new constitution was to be aimed on the laws of God as enunciated through a chosen prophet and then implemented through a form of democratic governance. The omnipotent voice of God would finally bring order to the chaotic society of men. These developments then introduced new possibilities for Smith's followers, and I want to provide one example. One of the inductees into this new council was a man named Albert Carrington, who then created a scriptural workbook, a little notebook that he filled with scriptural passages and his own interpretations, that he used to process this newly organized council. And this scriptural notebook, in many ways, seems as a mirror opposite copy of Thomas Paine's own biblical treatise. Because whereas Paine poked holes in the literalistic readings of the ancient texts, Carrington's study wove together passages from both the Old and the New Testaments that spoke of a coming kingdom of God promised by ancient apostles. He concluded that the causes for the blindness of people in the political world was not due to their lack of reason, but to the loss of inspiration from God, which led the governments instituting their own opinions and departing from the eternal meanings of laws. The pure political order was based not on democratic principles, but on, quote, covenants entered into between God and man by prophetic revelations. A democratic system that ignored the right religious authority, in other words, was destined for destruction. Another member of the council, Orson Hyde, the guy I mentioned earlier with the diagram, provides another example of a direct comparison between democratic and theocratic governance. While visiting Washington, D.C. on a diplomatic mission, Hyde was so disgusted by the disunity he found in the governing halls that he described Congress as, quote, a checkerboard, the members mere players who are extremely cautious as to how they move. Because they are so intent on pleasing their constituents and political party, rather than focusing on the real issues and the divine laws, they had become so tangled up and must be cut asunder. Hyde scoffed when comparing a democratic Congress where politicians represented only the interests of those who had influence to the Mormon Council of 50, where they would all work together in establishing God's will. There is more wisdom and order manifested in one of our councils at Nauvoo than you would ever see here, he wrote in a letter home. Hyde concluded that without divine governance, this prophetic authority, a republican form of government is as unwieldy in the hands of the people as the cannon in the hands of a schoolboy. In failing to acknowledge the true origin of rule, the American government, he argued, had lost its way. The apex of this reasoning came a month after the Council of 50's organization. On April 11th, it was moved, quote, that this honorable assembly receive from this time henceforth and forever Joseph Smith as our prophet, priest, and king, and uphold him in that capacity in which God has anointed him. The vote was then unanimous. a convergence of priestly rituals, political angst, and confined triumphalism, the figurative crowning of Joseph Smith symbolized the extent to which Mormons were willing to push for a centralized authority, the modern-day Moses. It also represented the realized bogeyman of Paine's deistic warnings, that a priestly figure clothed in immense power could dictate the thoughts and actions of American citizens. But what I find quite remarkable, besides everything else, is that even in this explicitly theocratic experiment, Joseph Smith was still unwilling to fully disentangle himself from democratic discourse. For example, Smith described the Council of 50's political title as Jeffersonianism, or Jeffersonian democracy, as properly understood, meaning that he believed these theocratic principles could fit within America's political system. These appeals, of course, likely would have made Jefferson spin in his grave. Yet Smith revised the very definition of democracy itself in a way that incorporated his theocratic ideas, calling it theodemocracy, a neologism that captured his blended purpose. Individuals still had liberty, yes, but a liberty that enabled them to follow divine counsel. A theodemocracy, explained Smith, was when, quote, the people get the voice of God and then acknowledge it. He even explained that the popular American maxim, vox populi, vox dei, should not mean the common translation of the voice of people is the voice of God, but rather the voice of people assenting to the voice of God. So even in critiquing the shortfalls of democracy, democratic language still drew capital. If Smith and others outrightly rejected the clarion call of Paine's Age of Reason, they were still working within a tradition, and a discursive tradition made famous through Paine's common sense. Unsurprisingly, those outside the faith did not find Smith's reasoning persuasive. News of the secret council quickly trickled outside of Nauvoo and garnered heated reactions. One editorial declared Smith had been crowned king under God by a council who had been sworn to secrecy under the penalty of death. The nature of this council betrayed American ideals, it argued. This new political body was confirmation that Smith and the Mormons were not willing to work within the boundaries of democratic governance. Ironically, however, those who eventually killed Smith as a mob while he was held in state custody ended up sharing some of his same assumptions concerning democracy's limits. That is, they came to believe that the political channels were far too slow, legal controls over religious liberty far too fragile, and political solutions far too corruptible. Democratic governance, the fruit born from the founding era of Paine, proved to be both too lenient, allowing dangerous sects to birth and develop, as well as too encumbered, unable to take swift justice necessary to protect society. As one Mormon believer noted, those who killed did not trust him, but that knew that the law could not touch him, but that powder and ball could. Threats to democracy at times required vigilante solutions in their mind. To conclude, allow me to return to the opening scene of my presentation. Joseph Smith Sr. witnessing his brother and father hurling Age of Reason at him. At that time, there was still a question as to how Christian the young American Republic could be. Decades later, however, a variety of Christian faiths had become fully ingrained within American society. Yet questions concerning religious belief and democratic rule remained, and groups like the Mormons, found on the margins of acceptability, struggled to pave their own way. Could America handle the pluralistic threat of such radical, incorporate such varied interests? In Joseph Smith's mind, the answer had proven to be no. And he, like Paine, was deemed a pariah to those outside his own community's boundaries. Boundaries that were still, to a large extent, defined by the same questions that animated Paine's own writings. So if Paine, upon seeing the climax of Nauvoo, would have wanted to hurl more diatribes against both Smith and his father, the Mormon prophet likely would have had plenty of ammunition to hurl right back. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you so much, Ben. That's an incredibly thought-provoking talk, and we're going to open it up to Q&A in a second. But I would just like to say quickly that it's fascinating to see the connections that you're drawing between, frankly, unexpected figures between Thomas Paine and Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church, and the ways in which the discourses of democracy and religiosity can dovetail and then move away from each other over the course of time. So thank you so much, and I'm going to do my silent.
Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you. So attendees, if you'd like, and there are already 2 questions, and so we'll go in that order. Type your questions into the Q&A. You are encouraged to do that. You may also use the hand clapping function, and that will allow me to allow you to talk. So you can choose either, but I think we should start first with the questions in the Q&A, and I'm just going to go in order here. So I'd like to start with Judith Clark. Thank you for your question, Judith. And Judith asks, what was Mormon's general opinion about African-American slavery?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a complicated question. Mormons, just like a lot of these denominations in America, especially those that drew people from multiple regions, had conflicting ideas. So the easy answer is that there were people who were abolitionists, and there were people who were pro-slavery within the Mormon movement. But to narrow down, maybe I'll just talk about Joseph Smith to show the complexity of the question. Joseph Smith, as far as we can tell from the very beginning, was always ideologically opposed to slavery. He saw slavery as a sin that needs to be overcome. And he even had some statements at some time that showed at least a nascent belief in racial equality. Yet at the same time, he was, like many northern white figures, he was also anti-abolitionist. He felt that abolitionists who were going too far to disrupt society to end slavery were doing more harm than good. He was also anti-mixed race marriages. And in Nauvoo, they had a law against African Americans and white Americans being able to marry each other. And Joseph Smith also seemed to, at some points, imply that once African Americans were freed from slavery, they should probably be sent somewhere else. So he might have been a colonizationist. But when he ran as a presidential candidate, he also ran on a moderate anti-slavery position, where he believed America should annex Texas, which was a big question in 1844, and the money that they would earn from then selling land in Texas could be used to compensate enslavers and forever free those who are enslaved. So that's a roundabout answer, but yeah, it's complicated. In general, I would cast most Mormons as the anti-slavery, but also anti-abolitionist camp.
Thank you, and then that is, I know, one of the major themes of your book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, which, shout out, if you're interested, please purchase a copy.
And I will add very quickly, there were a couple enslaved people who lived in Nauvoo itself. There were a couple converts from the South who joined the church, moved to Nauvoo, and followed. There are some loopholes in Illinois slavery laws at the time, and they took advantage of those. So slavery was present in Nauvoo, although it was very small.
And that's actually a really good transition into the next question from Barbara Crane. Thank you, Barbara. And Barbara thanks you for an eloquent and coherent presentation, and so do I, and I think we all do. But it's about Nauvoo, and the question is what was done with the inevitable dissenters? Were they punished or coerced, or did they just depart or defect?
Yeah, so the question of dissenters is eventually what led to Joseph Smith's death. Ever since the foundations of the Mormon church, there were those who felt that Joseph Smith was corrupting the church or leading it in new directions, because Joseph Smith is someone who was constantly evolving and moving the church. there's definitely going to be those who are not happy with the ways that he's moving it.
Mhm.
The way that Mormons typically dealt with dissenters was trying to force them out of the community. They learned this the hard way. First, when they were settled in Ohio, they felt that dissenters living within their ranks were going to cause problems. And the only way to solve those problems is to make sure that they're not around them. When the Mormons and Missourians got into a quasi-war in 1838, it was dissenters at the heart of the issue. So once they made it in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith was very wary to keep dissenters around him. And so there are several cases in which prominent Mormons fall against Joseph Smith, and there ends up being a battle between them, especially in the later years in Nauvoo when Joseph Smith introduces, and I can't believe we made 57 minutes in the presentation, polygamy. Polygamy is first mentioned. Once polygamy arrives, there's definitely a lot of dissenters who are not happy with that new practice. Eventually, in June of 1844, these dissenters become vociferous and united enough to start a newspaper. And Joseph Smith, as mayor of the city, afraid that that dissenting newspaper is going to cause a lot of problems, orders that newspaper's destruction. And that's what directly leads to his arrest. And while he's arrested, he's killed.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go next with Samuel Dodge, which is a fascinating question and one that I think you'll have a lot to say about. And I'm going to read this verbatim. If Mormonism offered stability in a prophetic structure, why would Catholicism not draw the same kind of adherence in the United States? Which, if Samuel understands correctly, increasingly largely from immigration, and I think that means Catholic adherence from immigration. In other words, what made Smith's prophetic authoritarianism more attractive than the Pope's?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, they definitely have similar authoritarian strains, at least especially in the eyes of the critics of both the Mormons and the Catholics. And it's notable that June 1844 features not just Joseph Smith being killed in Illinois, but the major anti-Catholic riot in Philadelphia. And those are just weeks separated. So it shows that there's a cultural connection there. What makes Joseph Smith's different, though, is a number of things. One, it's a homegrown religion, right? It's an American prophet, as opposed to looking to a foreign allegiance to a pope. Second, the Mormon claims of a modern day prophet were quite dissimilar to the claims of a pope. Those are different roles within their theological worlds. And Joseph Smith is able to claim different things. Now, Joseph Smith and the Mormons would see the Catholics as an example of how Christianity degenerated over the centuries. And so their narrative is a narrative of declension, whereas Catholics, it was a narrative of continuity of religious authority over the centuries. So I think there are some underlying similarities in their authoritative structure. And I think it's noteworthy that within a few years of Joseph Smith being pronounced prophet, priest, and king over their political empire, Catholicism introduces prophetic in Pope's infallibility just a few decades later at a Vatican Council. So I think there are similarities, even if the varieties are quite distinct.
Thank you, and the floor is now open. You may either type your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or if you flash your hand, I will allow you to talk. But please go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I do see Bruce Ingall's commented, is there evidence that Joseph Smith was influenced by the Fox sisters? No, just because the Fox sisters came a few years after Joseph Smith's death. The famous Fox sister rapping incident was 1848, and Joseph Smith dies in 1844. But I think you can definitely tell they're both products of upstate New York and the revivalism and the spiritual ingenuity that's taking place. So I think you can definitely cast them in the same cultural currents.
Mm-hmm. I think we have from Kimball Hunt. Thank you for your question. Excuse me 1 second. The question is, from Cassie Johnson. Why did he, by which I think you mean Joseph Smith, feel the need to create a new religion besides poking holes in the Christian religion? Was it just desire for a leading position or to pull away from old ways, or was it something more?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there are a number of ways that we can answer it, but I'll at least frame it in the way that Joseph Smith put it, because Joseph Smith frames his religious experience as originating in a vision that as a young boy, he received a visitation from God and Jesus Christ, who came and told him that none of the existing denominations had all the truth. And that if you, because he said, I go to the different denominations, they're all reading the same scriptural passages, but they had very different interpretations. So he wanted a religion that, you know, God could directly speak and answer those questions. And so I think it's important to note that at the very root of that movement then is a question of authority, that leaving it up to individual interpretations only leads to mass confusion. And so at least one of the driving factors of why Joseph Smith justified the new church was it provided an authoritative form of scriptural reading and doctrinal authority.
Thank you. And I will now go back to Kimball Hunt's question, excuse me. It is inspired by a review of your book on common consent. And it's a very interesting question. The reviewer of that book, of your book on common consent, noted that your focus was objectively upon politics, but that it ended up touching, your book that is, ended up touching more on subjective issues such as faith. And the question is, are you going to keep this framing going forward, and especially in one of your two new projects, or not, and why or why not?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The field of Mormon history, or writing about Joseph Smith and his movements, have definitely been fraught by these internal dynamics of who are you speaking to and what questions you're asking. My particular questions, as found in Kingdom of Nauvoo, and I hope to continue my next project, is using Mormonism as a lens to understand these other issues and these cultural movements. And to do so, I really think that it's important to, in religious studies terms, bracket those truth claims and not get into whether Joseph Smith was lying or so much or so forth, but rather understanding what does Joseph Smith attain and others inaugurated. So yeah, I think to me, that's the approach that especially in trying to reach a broader audience makes sense. Oh, you're on mute.
Not anymore. I have a question that kind of builds off of that, and it's a sort of broader question, and I know you address it in your book, and you talked a little bit about it here, but and certainly with connection to Paine and his thought, but I personally find it fascinating, and I think it's a fascinating sort of contour of American history, the ways in which the Mormon Church were a part of, but not a part of, a sort of common, if you will, but at least a Jacksonian elite white male political discourse, and the ways in which they dovetailed with it, but also broke from it. And I think my question for you is, and it's not just about Joseph Smith as an individual, but I think more about the ways in which this very sort of communal community, to be redundant, the ways in which they thought about, the ways in which they were a part of this common discourse, and whether or not they believed themselves to be a part of a sort of mainstream American politics.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. They believed that they were distinct. They were very clear that America is a distinct project and we are the chosen people. We're the peculiar people who are paving our own path, distinct from that failed democratic system. At the same time, I worry that historians over the years have taken their word for it, and instead they frame the Mormons as these outsiders. One of the most famous framings is Richard Moore, when he said Mormons are these religious outsiders. And so Mormons are often used as an example of like this counter of this outside of American culture moment. They represent the extremes. They don't really have much larger explanatory value. Whereas I truly believe that looking at the Mormon experience, we're not just looking at some quixotic, crazy story, but we can see something that tells us a lot about Jacksonian America, something that helps us understand these broader currents, so that even if the Mormon actions turn out to be radical, and those actions are unique, the underlying anxieties that cause them are something that would have been shared across their culture.
Thank you. I have many more questions to ask, but I'll restrain myself. And Barbara Crane is asking, what happened to Nauvoo?
Yeah, so 18 months after Joseph Smith dies, Mormons are forced to flee Nauvoo. The Mormonism was just going to die as soon as Joseph Smith did. But instead, it just grew. I mean, Brigham Young, who was one of Joseph Smith's close associates, took control of a majority of the believers in Nauvoo. And the cultural clashes continued. The Mormons did not just give up on politics once Joseph Smith was gone. And so soon the neighbors realized that there's no peaceful end in sight. And so they basically said it's either us or them. And there was a brief series of skirmishes, casualties on both sides, and eventually the state had to step in. And the governor at the time, Thomas Ford, basically had a very awkward discussion with Mormon leaders that said, hey, I don't have authority to do this, but you guys need to leave. And by that time, Brigham Young and others saw that there is no peaceful resolution here, so we should probably leave. And that's when they decided to move out to what is now present-day Utah. And that led to this big migration in February of 1846. Now that out-migration was a long and chaotic process, but within a year, there are a few Mormons remaining in the area, and it returned to this very quiet city. Now, those who followed Brigham Young out to Utah, that became the largest Mormon population. There were several other groups of Mormons who remained out in the Midwest. And eventually they formed their own religion based around Joseph Smith's own family. Joseph Smith's wife, Emma Smith, his son, Joseph Smith III, became the prophet of the new religion. And they actually maintained a presence in Nauvoo long after the Utah-based LDS church did. Today you go to Nauvoo, and it's basically, as some observers call, the Mormon Williamsburg. There's dozens of restored homes. It's a pilgrimage site for Mormons of all the different denominations that trace back to Joseph Smith. You can walk through Joseph Smith's home. You can look at the big marble temple on the hill. And so today is kind of like a historic site, but remarkably, there's only about 2,000 people who live there today, which is only about a tenth of the size at its Mormon zenith back in the 1840s.
Fascinating, fascinating. I'm going now to pivot to Jordan Greger's question, and this is a really great question. I might add a little bit of editorialism to it, but not much. Would you consider, or I'll add, or to what degree, were Joseph Smith and Mormonism a product of the Enlightenment era that had recently ended, or a rebellion against it?
Right. That's a good question. To a certain degree, all religions were living in the shadow of the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment initiated new ideas or ways to talk about religion or ways to define religion that even those religions that, cast themselves as polar opposites of Thomas Paine were forced to adapt. They saw themselves as, correcting a course of too much secularism, which they probably would have defined as, the legacy of the Enlightenment, the separation of spiritual and natural. Mormons still used Enlightenment tools to try to define their religion. I love the term that one scholar of Unitarian used of rational supernaturalism, right? They have their supernatural beliefs, but they're trying to use rational methods to define it. Perhaps the most fun example of this is Joseph Smith says, yes, there are angels. And by the way, there's a way you can test them, right? If the Enlightenment is all about being able to test and quantify, you can test whether an angel is a true angel by stretching out your hand, and they will shake it and you will feel their power. So on the one hand, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers will say that's not Enlightenment, right? Enlightenment would cause great suspicion on such a scenario. But Joseph Smith and the Mormons, they say, well, there are some tools of discernment that we can use to defend our supernatural beliefs. So I would say that there are definitely some legacies of the Enlightenment still around with the Mormons, even if they're rejecting a lot of the other major lessons.
Thank you. That's so fascinating, really. And I'm going to sort of combine the Dr. Nora Slanimsky's question. Shout out Nora, director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, and one that I have that's my own, and I think that I think will work together, connected. So Nora asks, do you see Thomas Paine playing a role in either of your two future book projects? And I would just sort of add to that. What I learned especially from this talk, is that to reduce the religious, the religiosity or the religious ideology of somebody like Thomas Paine and somebody like Joseph Smith or the Mormon Church to very basic definitions is both flawed and also not particularly helpful for understanding the 19th century. So it's one thing to say that Thomas Paine was not Christian. Right. It's another thing to grapple with the complexities of his own religious beliefs, just as it's true, as you told us in your presentation, that the ways in which Mormonism fit in with, but was also a part of both mainstream, and in your answer that you just gave, the broader Enlightenment background, but also drew from contemporary, especially Christian evangelical beliefs, it is also unfair. And so how do you see Thomas Paine, or do you at all seeing him figure into your two projects moving forward?
Yeah, so both really good questions. On Thomas Paine himself, I think one thing, especially when talking to public audiences about him, the biggest misconception I have to disprove is that he didn't believe in religion at all, right? I mean, deism did assume a form of a higher being. It was just the organized religion, and specifically the organized religions he was attacking, that was important. Thomas Paine himself does not factor explicitly in my two projects, but the legacies of him are a way to frame it, kind of like how I used Paine to frame the Nauvoo experience tonight in two ways. So in the Mormon example, one of the themes I'm tracing out in this new project are the issues of belief and doubt in Mormonism as a way to kind of look at issues of belief and doubt in America since its founding. Thomas Paine provided one model of what belief should and shouldn't look like. And to a certain degree, as I outlined tonight, a lot of American Christians were responding to Paine. Like, he was the bogeyman they had in mind when saying that either we need to be more religious or we need to embrace this more rational form of thinking. So Paine's shadow definitely is cast over the Mormon experience, just like many evangelical experiences. When they're trying to define their religion as rational, they're responding to the Paine-like figure. Then when it comes to religion and abolition, he proves a very fascinating counterexample to the people I find fascinating in that project. And that Thomas Paine was ideologically anti-slavery, but again, kind of like Joseph Smith, never did anything about it, type of thing. So Thomas Paine was ideologically anti-slavery, and he believed that religion would buttress the slave institution. So he saw Christianity as one of the types of stumbling blocks away from abolishing slavery. What I find fascinating, though, are those especially in the 1850s, who saw religion not just as the foundation for their anti-slavery critique, but the instigator for their action, their anti-slavery action. I'm fascinated by the question of what draws someone from being anti-slavery in principle to anti-slavery in practice, especially to the point of, say, civil disobedience or outright war and bloodshed. And I'm interested in the role that religion plays in that. Because Thomas Paine would have said religion doesn't play a role in that at all. If you're a Christian, you're going to accept authority, and you're not going to be able to, topple down the slavery system. Where I see a lot of people, including like Theodore Parker, for example, the minister in Boston, who is frequently called a Painite, a label that he hated, makes me anti-slavery activist. So that's kind of how Paine would relate to my new projects.
Thanks very much. We have time for a couple of more questions. You may either put them in the Q&A, and I see that there is a new one, I believe now. And this is a follow-up from Cassie Johnson. That is, excuse me, asking about Joseph Smith's life and his age when he created Mormonism and when he died, but then also uh, the general sense after his death that the Mormon community had for how long Mormonism as an established institution would live on beyond him.
Yeah, so Joseph Smith was born in 1805, and he claims he was in his teenage years when he received his first vision. It was in 1821 that he claimed that he received or first started receiving visions concerning gold plates that he would translate that became the Book of Mormon. And it was 1830 when he was the ripe old age of 24 and a half that he became the founder of this new Mormon religion. And he was just shy of the age of 44 when he died at the hands of the mob. So it's remarkable how young he was and how much he was able to accomplish in those years. Mormonism, of course, quickly develops after his death, even though there were many that thought it would die with Joseph Smith leaving the scene. And in fact, there was a New York Tribune article that started out, "So is the death of Mormonism," when mentioning Joseph Smith dying. But instead, it continued to grow. There were probably tens of thousands of believers at the time of Joseph Smith's death. Within a few decades, that's hundreds of thousands of believers. And once the church that followed Joseph Smith out to Salt Lake City, they continue to grow. And today, they have, I don't know the exact number, but over 17 million members worldwide. So it was definitely, unlike what many like Paine and Jefferson would have assumed, the crazy, Mormon religion only continued to blossom.
Thank you, and thank you for your question, Cassie. We still have the Q&A open, and I believe one more has just come in. And this is Barbara Corinne again. And it's a question that asks us to think about the relationship of what we would today consider modern feminism. But the question is, were women always subservient in Mormonism? Was it always pro-natalist favoring?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. One of the things that I try to do in my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, is restore the place that women, the role that women played in the story. Because there is this perception that this question has that women were merely subservient and just, reacting to what's going on. But when I dug into the history of Nauvoo, I was amazed at how much action the women there did. That they were pushing for reform, that they were making political arguments, that they were appealing to state officials. Even when it comes to polygamy, women were shaping the discussions around polygamy and how it was to be practiced. Women also exerted a degree of authority in Nauvoo that was rarely seen during the period. They formed their own organization that they called the Relief Society that acted not just as a religious organization, but a social organization that was going to reform all of society. They would go meet with state officials. They would ask for political endorsements. And at one point in Nauvoo, there was a governing council that included both men and women on it. Now that gendered experiment ended up failing in Nauvoo because soon over the issue of polygamy, Joseph Smith came to distrust a lot of the women for their opposition to polygamy, including his own wife, Emma. And so toward the end of his life, Joseph Smith said, "I never had any problems until those women got involved." And so the story of women and power and authority in Nauvoo is a fascinating roller coaster ride that does not really fit our typically assumed stereotypes.
I actually wanted to follow up on that, and I think that's fascinating. I think it's one of the most important aspects of your book, just based on your research and your sort of broader research agenda in the 19th century. I think most of us here know, of course, that part and parcel to the rise of the Jacksonian democracy was the disfranchisement of women, finally ending in the state of New Jersey in 1804. Do you have a sense for the degree to which women in Nauvoo, just to take that example, actually were exercising political activism in a way that might have been outside of the mainstream for women and outside of the community?
They definitely weren't arguing for suffrage, just to get that clear from the start in Nauvoo. But they were interested in politics. So for instance, Emma Smith, who was Joseph Smith's wife and the president of the Relief Society, would go and meet with the gov petitions or write things together on political issues. They saw their purview, like many women who were in these reformist movements, and says, okay, if you're saying we're guardians of the hearth, where a lot of things take place in the hearth, and we need to be able to have a voice in them, whether it be alcoholism or abolition or school reform or prison reform or what have you. The same principles were going on in Nauvoo. I'll also quickly add that those same women who are doing those actions in Nauvoo, later when they go out to Utah, do take up suffrage to a profound degree. And Utah ends up passing women's suffrage laws earlier than every other state or territory except for Wyoming. In fact, Utah, because they passed their suffrage law after Wyoming, but they had a vote before Wyoming did, Utah can boast that they were the first territory or state in which women were granted the authority and actually exercised it.
And that really, I think, very much complicates the sort of narratives that we might have about women's women's politics and activism in the Mormon community. Kimball Smith has a question for you, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong. But the question is about Joseph Smith's grandfather, the Universalist minister, Asael Smith. I don't know if I pronounced that. Basil Smith, and the ways in which his grandfather's background might have figured into Joseph's own religiosity and eventual teachings.
Yeah, so there's definitely some universalist strains that you find in some of Joseph Smith's teachings, including his revelations that kind of imply that there's some progression after this life as people become more and more perfectionists. So I don't think you can ever trace any direct influence to Joseph Smith, as much as there's these ideas floating around in this culture that different people are responding to. And Joseph Smith definitely took part in that. So to the point of where one of the early exhaustive criticisms of Joseph Smith, of someone actually dealing with his theology rather than just dismissing him as a crazy person, claimed that Mormonism is just a mixture of Congregationalism, Universalism, Baptist, Masonry, all rolled into one. And I think there was some truth there, that Joseph Smith wasn't so convinced about which tradition had which ideas as much as he was kind of taking the cafeteria approach, the smorgasbord approach of picking which ideas could respond to society's problems.
Thank you. We have time for one. We have a few minutes left. We have time for one more question. If anybody wants to type in the Q&A. If not, then I'll wait for a second. I actually have a somewhat playful question for you. So I'll just wait for a second to see if anybody has one final question. And I'll also say thank you so much for your fascinating presentation.
Let's end on the playful question.
Okay. So.
Oh wait, no, there was one more that came in. Sorry.
No, yeah, of course. How
has the Mormon Church responded to my research?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. There's been no formal response, just like they don't do formal response to most pieces of scholarship today. I mean, I have personal conversations with some people, both lay and leadership level, that have varying degrees. You'll find some people within the LDS Church who are very open to this type of research and they embrace it. And you'll find other people who denounce my book as sensationalist and focused on only the bad things and not, promoting faith. So I think you'd find a broad spectrum of responses, but the church itself, there's no official response to it. I'm not big enough for that type of
thing. And you don't expect that to be the case?
No.
So if I may ask my playful question, in the spirit of Thomas Paine, and I'll just say Joseph Smith, not to speak of all Mormonism, in an alternate universe in which they lived together at the same time and were adults and could speak to each other, what do you imagine a meeting between Joseph Smith and Thomas Paine to have been like? Let's say they're in a tavern having a coffee, just for the purposes of conjuring.
Yeah, I think they would have had some clear points of disagreement. They would have disagreed on the role, on the potential of democracy in the human mind when divorced from religious leadership. But in the spirit of the question, I also think that they would have found plenty to drink on, to say cheers to, in that they both would have detested traditional and organized religion. They would have thought that so many problems in the world were a result of corrupt religious and political leaders who are only after their own interests and have radical ideas that are not found in reason. Now, what they would have defined as reason would have been very different between them, but I think they would have had, and of course, they could both be jovial figures. So I think there's plenty there where they actually would have found some commonalities.
Unexpectedly, they might have become friends too.
Yeah, there you go. One of those frenemies, we'll call them, like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia type of friendship.
I think that's the best place to end it. I want to congratulate you and thank you so much for being with us tonight. This has been a fantastic beginning to the conference, and we appreciate it so much that you're able to be here with us. And I encourage everybody to purchase or to research into really purchase A Kingdom of Nauvoo. And thank you so much, Ben, for being with us, and we so appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's been a great honor. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thanks very much. And speaking of the rest of the conference, you can find the link to our program at the very top of the chat if you scroll all the way up. Please, if you're interested, register in other panels, and we hope to see you tomorrow and Saturday, and have a fantastic rest of your Thursday evening. Thank you to the Thomas Paine Cottage for this fantastic collaboration, and I hope you all have a fantastic night.